Here's my entire 13-part brisket full cook series in one long video. Let's start by making the rub. For this cook, I made my own rub with Morton's kosher salt, coarse ground black pepper, granulated onion, granulated garlic, and chili powder. You can feel free to just use salt and pepper or experiment with other spices to find what you like. Most barbecue joints out there use more than just salt and pepper, no matter what they say, so don't limit yourself. Measure everything out, add to a shaker, and set aside. Here's how I prep everything to trim a brisket. Get a big enough cutting board to fit the entire brisket and secure it to your surface with a silicone mat or wet paper towel. But don't use a wet paper towel with a wood cutting board because it will waterlog it. You don't want that cutting board sliding around while you're trimming. Use a cut glove on at least your non-dominant hand to protect from knife slips. I'm going to start wearing one on my dominant hand just for an extra layer of protection. One slip and you're in the ER. I cover my cut glove with a nitrile glove to keep it clean. I also wear nitrile gloves so my hands don't smell like beef all day long and keep my germs off the meat. Open the brisket by slicing the package along the decal fat on the meat side. Remove the packaging while keeping the juices in so they don't spill everywhere. Then pat it down with a paper towel. Get a container to hold the trimmings and a trash can nearby. Let's learn about the parts of a brisket. A packer brisket consists of two muscles, the point and the flat. On the fat side, you have the point at the top of the screen and the flat at the bottom of the screen. The mohawk is the meat and fat that sticks up on the upper left-hand side of your screen, and across from that is what I call the hump. On the meat side, you have the flat meat and the decal fat. You can also see the point at the top of the screen as well. In between those two muscles is a big hunk of solid fat called the decal fat. Back on the fat side, you can see this big part right here is the point. Now I'm going to show you how I trim a brisket. I start by taking off the mohawk and then rounding off that point. I square off that long side and round off that corner. This brisket had a lot of fat on that side, so I carved more of that out. I flipped it over to the meat side and then shaved off the decal and cleaned up that long side. I'm using a 10-inch slicing knife for most of these cuts today. I personally like to use a longer knife to trim, but I switch to my 6-inch or 4-inch knife when I need to be more precise. I shortened the brisket to 18 inches so it would fit on my smoker and then cleaned up the corners. I shaved some of the hard fat off of the hump and then cleaned up the fat on top of the flat. I shoot for about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch of fat there. Back on the meat side, I carved out the decal and then cleaned up the fat globs on the flat. Each brisket will take you about 8 to 10 minutes depending on how much fat and the condition of the brisket. None of these trimmings go to waste. I make burgers, sausage, and tallow with them. Now we're going to rub our brisket. Before you apply the rub, you can optionally add a binder to help the rub stick to the meat. Lots of people use yellow mustard or mustard plus something to thin it out like Worcester sauce or pickle juice. You could also just use water or rub the meat to make it tacky. Starting on the fat side, apply your binder, then flip it over and do the other side. Then apply your rub. Make sure you apply it evenly and get the sides as well. I like to pat it down to help it stick, but do not rub it in. Hold the bottle about 1 foot above the brisket so it falls more uniformly. I use the big opening of the bottle cap and manage the flow with the side-to-side motion of my wrist. Flip it back over to the fat side, apply the rub, and make sure you get those sides as well. If the rub isn't sticking at this point, you can apply more binder. You can also use your left hand as a deflection point when you apply the rub to the sides. I usually put 2 briskets in each tub, cover with plastic wrap, and then in the fridge for the night. In the next part of the series, we're going to head outside and fire up the smokers. We're smoking 4 briskets, 2 on the pellet smoker and 2 on the Weber Smoky Mountain. For the WSM, I lay down 2 layers of charcoal, add lit coals in the middle, and then add wood throughout the cook. I used to put wood chunks under the charcoal, but found it never combusted and just smoldered. Instead, I rotate wood chunks from the middle grate to keep them warm, and then feed them to the fire throughout the cook. It's more work during the cook, but I've found that the smoke runs cleaner that way. For the pellet smoker, I put both briskets on the upper rack, a water pan under them, and a tallow pan over to the right. I set it to 180, turn on super smoke, and use oak pellets. I insert my probes through the sides into the middle of the point and the flat. You don't want to poke your probe through the fat cap as it will mess with your bark. For these types of smokers, it helps to start low and work your way up to 275 so the smoke has time to penetrate the meat. I smoke for 2 hours at 180, 2 hours at 225, and then 250 until I wrap and finish at 275. You'll need to experiment with what works best for your smoker, as they're all different. I like to spritz my briskets with an apple cider vinegar and Worcester sauce mix every 30 minutes during the first 4 hours. That moist surface helps attract smoke particles, the sugars help with bark formation, and it helps control the temp so the outside doesn't cook faster than the inside. Spritzing is optional, so if it's your first time smoking a brisket, I recommend trying it and seeing how it goes. If you don't like the results, then don't spritz your next one. There's no one way to do barbecue. You experiment and find what works for you. Now let's make some tallow. I take all the hard fat that I trimmed off the brisket and render it down to tallow in a pan while I smoke. A few times throughout the cook, I'll strain that rendered fat into a glass jar. Tallow is pure beef fat that can be used as a cooking fat, butter substitute, soap, or even candles. I use it when I wrap briskets to help keep it moist as it rests. I also make tallow cubes to put in my vac seal bags when I portion out my leftovers. That way there's plenty of fat in there when you reheat it. Just don't keep the tallow on the smoker too long as it will burn. You shouldn't need to grind the meat before rendering it. I just put big chunks and empty the fat every hour or so. Also, make sure you cover the jar if you're going to leave it outside. One of the issues you may run into when smoking a brisket is a dried out flat in an unrendered fat cap. To combat that, you can put the brisket in a boat to protect the flat and keep the fat side exposed, so it can continue to render and build a better bark. But when you boat, you will sacrifice some of the bottom bark because the brisket will sit in the collective fat and it will wash some of it away. I typically boat with foil, but I've been wanting to try to cook with less foil, so I tried to make a paper boat for this cook. I like the idea of a paper boat, but even though I spritzed the paper with water, I couldn't get it to form well enough around the sides of the brisket. I may continue to experiment with the paper boat or just go back to using foil. Let me know if you have any ideas for how I can make the paper boat work. When I foil boat a brisket, I crisscross 2 sheets of foil and then crimp up the sides, put in some tallow, add the brisket, and then touch up the foil edges. Boating is an optional step, but if you find that your flats are dry and your fat cap isn't rendered, then you may want to give it a try. Wrapping briskets completely in foil or paper is optional. You'll want to wrap to help speed up the cook or to prevent your bark from getting too dark. Don't bother wrapping if your bark isn't as dark as you like it. When wrapping with paper, lay down 2 sheets of 18-inch butcher paper. Spritz with water to make it more pliable. Add tallow, place the brisket, and then more tallow on top. The tallow helps keep it moist while it rests. Fold the bottom up and over and tuck it under the brisket. Then fold over the sides and crimp the long edges. Flip the brisket and then square off the paper's top edge. Then flip one more time so it's back to fat side up. Lots of Texas barbecue joints wrap with foil and a lot wrap with paper. I recommend you try both ways to see which one you like best. I found that paper is the way to go if you want crunchier bark and foil if you want more moist bark. You'll do a similar approach with foil. 2 sheets of foil, put down some tallow, add the brisket, and then fold the short edges and then the long edges. It goes back into the smoker until the internal temps hit 195 to 203 plus and is probe tender throughout. Now that your briskets are at least 195 to 203 plus degrees and are probe tender, we're going to move them to our food warmer set at 150 degrees until the next day, which ended up being about 12 hours for this cook. But I've gone as long as 17 hours without a problem. If I'm only smoking one brisket, I'll put it in my smart oven or regular oven, but I often need it for other things like sides, which led me to getting the food warmer. If your oven doesn't go down to 150 degrees, then check your manual, as most ovens allow you to calibrate to a lower temp. And make sure that you're monitoring the brisket temps while you're hot holding or resting. Keep them above 140 degrees to be safe. If you're serving the briskets the same day, make sure they rest for at least 5 hours and definitely take them to 203 plus and probe tender. When you need to transport your brisket from your house to the party, you'll move them from your food warmer to your Canberra or cooler lined with towels or blankets. The briskets will stay at a good serving temp for at least 4 hours. Now we're ready to serve and slice our briskets. After unwrapping them, I like to pat them with some tallow from the paper with my hands. I used to pour it on, but I prefer to pat so I can control how much gets on there. I'm wearing cotton gloves under my nitrile gloves so the hot brisket is easier to handle while slicing. Start by slicing it down the middle where the point meets the flat. Then take a look at that cross cut. You'll want to see a smoke ring around the bottom. That pinkish ring tells you that you ran a good clean fire. Don't stress if you don't have a smoke ring, but think about how you can apply cleaner smoke at the beginning of your cook. You also don't want to see any thick white fat on the top or between the two muscles. I have some here because I didn't trim enough fat off of that one spot. That happens, don't stress about it, just trim it out now before you serve it. I then cut off the end of the point that was the hump, trim off that flat muscle, and then serve that to the party VIPs or anyone hanging around the table. Those are known as burnt ends and are one of the best bites in barbecue. Then continue slicing the point in the same direction and only slice what you need to serve, because you don't want the slices to prematurely oxidate. A good indication that the brisket was cooked right is the bend and pull test. A slice should easily fold in half and it should pull apart with ease. If it falls apart here, then you've overcooked it. Next time, try to remove it from the heat when it just reaches probe tenderness. You'll slice the flat muscle along the same cut that you made at the beginning. Aim for a number 2 pencil width cut on the flat and a carpenter's pencil width on the point. Any remaining meat can be chopped up for the folks that want brisket sandwiches. Here's my full 3-day brisket schedule. On or before day 1, I'll buy the briskets. I keep them in the fridge until day 1 and try not to put them in the freezer unless absolutely necessary. At around 5:30, I'll put the briskets in the freezer so the fat is easier to cut. I'll make a custom rub and then trim, slather, rub, and put them in the fridge for the night. Day 2 starts at 9 a.m. I'll start smoking at 180, bump to 225 after 2 hours, and then 250 after another 2 hours. Spritzing every half hour-ish as needed. I render the tallow throughout the cook and then strain it before I boat. I wrap the briskets around 6 p.m., but only if the fat cap is fully rendered and I'm happy with the bark. The brisket's usually 180 degrees at this point. I then bump up the smoker temp to 275 to help accelerate the cook. When the briskets are at least 195 degrees and probe tender, I'll pull them from the heat and hot hold them in my food warmer overnight. On day 3, I'll pull them from my food warmer, transport them if necessary, and then slice and serve. Hopefully this brisket series has been helpful for you, and feel free to join my Patreon if you want one-on-one help with your cooks.